In this connection, I would like to define the basic terms of my presentation. I made one reference to being projected as being Jewish, and I would like to be projected or identified as being of Jewish origin. And the other distinction I would wish to make is a distinction between popular racism and xenophobia and the way I use the term apartheid. I don't collapse the two terms, and I attempt to make a very clear distinction. In terms of popular xenophobia or racism, I believe there is some credence in the argument of Israeli embassies and official Israeli instruments of information that in terms of qualitative distinctions, popular racism and xenophobia in Israel is not qualitatively that different from popular xenophobia or racism in the United Kingdom, in North America, in Indonesia, Malaysia, or most member states of the United Nations organization. I've lived and worked in North America, I've lived and worked in the United Kingdom, I've been born in Jerusalem and educated in the Hebrew educational system, and I believe there is some credence to that argument. But that is not exactly apartheid. My understanding of apartheid is a political system that regulates xenophobia and racism through acts of parliament and implements these regulations and acts of parliament through the law enforcement instruments of the state. And this particular system of apartheid is not that common. And I hope to be corrected, but so far I have not been corrected. To my knowledge, and my knowledge can be limited, is limited, after the demise of apartheid in South Africa, Israel remains the only member state of the United Nations organization that is an apartheid state. And when a Zionist party claims that, well, Israel is not qualitatively different from other member states insofar as popular xenophobia and racism is concerned, and singling out Israel relative to other states is therefore motivated by an ulterior motive, and usually the allegation is that it's motivated by anti-Jewish racism, anti-Semitism. Again, I would say, allow them that argument, but Israel should be singled out as the only apartheid state that is a member state of the United Nations, and on that basis should be combated just as apartheid in South Africa was resisted and combated. And I would therefore, I'm delighted that over the years since I introduced the definition of Israel as an apartheid state in the late 80s, the reference to Israel as an apartheid state has become more and more established, initially in movement circles and progressively at more established circles. And there are many advantages to empowering that orientation and insisting on that orientation. One good reason is that we have ready international law instruments available to apply against apartheid states, notably the International Convention, the UN International Convention for the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. Now, there have been parties within the anti-Zionist camp, for instance, ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolition, that had attempted to divert attention from the application of the term apartheid to Israel by claiming that apartheid is unique to South Africa and apartheid is of different nature in a Zionist context and an Israeli settler colonial context. And they advocated, at least for a while, perhaps no longer, that just as the Afrikaans term was used in South Africa, the Hebrew term should be used with reference to settler colonial Israel. A suggestion was nishul, dispossession, or hafrada, separation, which at the abstract and theoretical level, again, may have some credence, but it has a practical deficiency. There isn't on the books in international law a UN Convention for the Suppression and Punishment of Nishul. And there isn't international law suppression and punishment of Hafrada. But there is available for us to apply an international convention, and the term apartheid applies to what happens in Palestine since the Zionist intervention into the country as a settler colonial project, and I would wholeheartedly support the amplification of the term, and it will eventually get to UN levels, I'm quite certain, with the empowerment of anti-apartheid movement, sanctions and boycott and divestment movement worldwide, similar to anti-apartheid as that was directed against the regime, the apartheid regime in South Africa. So racism is not apartheid, and apartheid in my narrative is not racism. And I would again not very much quarrel with the Zionist party that succeeded to remove out of UN books the resolution of Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, which is correct. They won an important victory by having it removed, and we should amplify or build upon, in a way, rescue the setback by saying, okay, you have that resolution, we'll introduce into the United Nations an additional resolution. Israel is an apartheid state, a form of apartheid and apartheid discrimination, and we can win that argument quite easily, because consequent to the work of many people, including the IJAN recently formed, the reality of apartheid in Israel is progressively being exposed. Now, an argument again within liberal or sometimes radical movement circle has been that Israel is distinctly different. The situation in Israel is distinctly different from the situation of apartheid South Africa, and the analogy does not fundamentally obtain. And my argument is nuanced. Yes, there is an important difference between Israeli apartheid and South African apartheid, but not at core. Not at core. At core, the conflict in Palestine is a conflict between a settler colonial project and the indigenous people of Palestine, the Arab Palestinian people. At core in South Africa, it was a settler colonial project in conflict with the indigenous peoples of South Africa, and settler colonial projects are primarily concerned with control of land and subsoil. In South Africa, land and subsoil, precious mineral. In Palestine, land and subsoil, an element that's far more precious than precious minerals, namely water. And the consequence of apartheid in South Africa, in the negative sense, has been much more devastating relative to the consequences in Palestine. The other way around. The consequences in Palestine have been more devastating. Apartheid legislation in Palestine, Israeli apartheid legislation, has resulted in 93% of the territory of pre-67 Israel. I'm not even speaking of the post-67 occupied territories. 93% of pre-67 Israel being reserved in law for Jews only. In South Africa, at the height of the apartheid regime, it was 87%. So in terms of core disasters, the disaster in Palestine is more severe. And the question that has preoccupied me for some time, and I believe I have a part answer, is if there is substance to my factual presentation, then how was it possible for the state of Israel, an apartheid state, a settler colonial state, to project itself over so many decades and the only democracy in the Middle East? And here is where the Jewish National Fund and similar functions come into play. My generation has developed intellectually against a predominant Marxist narrative. Some of us joined Marxist or Trotskyist or other Marxist-Leninist organizations and movements. Others have refrained from doing so. I have been one of those who have refrained from doing so, and if you want to know why, I'm happy to elaborate in response to questions. But that has been, in a movement context and in a resistant context, an important narrative to which we related. And in terms of a Marxist analysis, the judiciary is an essential aspect of the state. The state is the state is essentially an oppressive mechanism, and the recourse to law is therefore less effective relative to other avenues